welcome to Time for 100%, a forum on 100% renewable energy hosted by People's Action for Clean Energy, or PACE. My name is Mark Scully. I'm president of PACE. And to say that we are excited about today is an understatement. I think we're downright giddy at the event that we've planned. PACE has been following the work of Mark Jacobson for years. We've been in conversation with Mark about coming and receiving an award and speaking for years. It's taken us a few years to get our calendars synchronized, but we're absolutely thrilled that Mark Jacobson is here today and that we have a very distinguished local panel of local experts to really give this topic of 100% renewable energy a good, constructive, thorough discussion. So thank you for being here. We're thrilled at the speakers that we have lined up. We're also thrilled that so many of you are here today and that we have a very diverse group. We have environmental organizations. We have people from academia. We have people from the utility. We have people who are in positions of making decisions. You know, very often some of us in the environmental side of things go to conferences and it's kind of a lot of environmental organizations agreeing with each other. Well, and I think what's great is we have a real mix today of some people who are out there caring passionately and advocating, and also many who are in the positions of making decisions and executing on these. So we have potential to have a really meaningful discussion today, so I invite you to that, and I welcome you. You have in your program a brief biography of Mark Jacobson, so I won't go through all of his qualifications for you. Mark's work stands out in its singular focus on understanding and solving large-scale air pollution and climate problems. As a teenager looking at the air pollution in Los Angeles and San Diego, Mark asked himself, why should people have to live like this? It was not until he got to graduate school that he really had found an academic program where which allowed him to focus on this topic. Since that time, Mark has been a prolific, original writer of rigorous, peer-reviewed scientific papers on topics ranging from roadmaps to transitioning the world to 100% renewable energy, to reliability of the electric grid with a high penetration of renewables, to taming hurricanes with arrays of offshore wind farms. Mark is also a co-founder of the Solutions Project, a science-based collective movement to advance the cause of 100% renewable energy. And as I was rereading this morning, I thought, yes, it's a science-based organization. I thought that should be matter of fact, but we actually have to defend that these days. So Mark's contribution to the literature and to the body of research about renewable energy really stands out in its originality, in its thoroughness. Mark has written something over 150 peer-reviewed scientific papers. As I say, you've got a list here of his qualifications, but it is a body of work that is very impressive, and it is very rigorous and is very helpful and necessary to this whole discussion. Professor Jacobson's work is characterized not only by its originality and moral clarity, but also by its courage. As you can imagine, one does not write papers that threaten to disrupt conventional wisdom or vested interests without generating some controversy. And Mark has been the object of many attacks. But here, too, he has been a tireless advocate, responding forcefully and substantively in defense of the truth. Mark's work, as I say, has been extremely influential to PACE, really encouraging us to see that a route to 100% renewable energy is technically and economically feasible and achievable. It is really the social and the political realms that get in the way. So it's therefore a great pleasure, it's a very personal pleasure for us at PACE to be able to give this award, the Judy Friedman Lifetime Achievement Award. I'm going to read it to you and ask Mark to come up. For a distinguished career dedicated to finding solutions to large-scale air pollution and climate problems, Professor Jacobson has carried out original and important research on the feasibility of wind, water, and solar energy to meet the needs of buildings, cities, states, and countries around the world. In so doing, he has given scientific rigor to a public discussion that is central to the survival of humanity. As a co-founder of the Solutions Project, he is providing a scientific basis for a collective movement to promote 100% renewable energy. Mark, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that great introduction, kind introduction, this really nice award I'm very humbled by, and also for inviting me tirelessly to come here. I mean, it's something I want to do as much as possible, is to get out the information that we've been developing, to get it out to the public and policymakers. That's really our goal. I am finding challenges traveling. It's not always easy, since I still have a child who's under 10 and I'm teaching, but I just, whenever I can, I really do want to get out here, and I'm glad I was able to come. So what I want to talk about today are these renewable energy plans that we've been developing over the last decade. Our first plan came out in 2009 in Scientific American on how to power the whole world with clean renewable energy, or to really see, is it possible, even though we can't actually implement a global scale plan on its own, because there's nobody who just controls the whole world, fortunately, I guess. Yeah, I'm going to try to speak louder. I can usually project pretty well. So since then, we've been developing individual state plans and country plans, and now city and town plans. But I just want to point out this one paper that we did in 2014, which had a lot of co-authors, including some from back east here and a lot of students. This was a plan to repower California for all purposes with just wind and water and solar. And I'm happy to say that this was actually implemented into law a couple months ago with SB 100 in the electric power sector by not only the state Senate, the state assembly, and the governor signed it finally. But the governor also issued an executive order that is not binding on the next governor, who's just been elected, but really indicates what his intent is, which was to repower California for all purposes with clean renewable energy. That's what the executive order is. The law, SB 100, is just in the electric power sector, and it effectively goes to 100% renewables by 2045 with 60% by 2030. More recently, we've noticed just in this last election, there were 3 new governors who all have the platform of 100% renewable energy, including in Illinois, Michigan, and Colorado. And Nevada passed at least the first step of a 50% renewable portfolio standard by 2030. So there is some progress. Hawaii has a 100% clean renewable energy standard. Well, at the end of my talk, I'll actually get to more of the policies, but I want to, in between, talk about more of the science, about what can be done not only in states and countries, but also cities, towns, and in individual homes, how you can transition to clean renewable energy. Well, first, a little bit about our motivation for developing these roadmaps. I've been interested in trying to understand and solve large-scale air pollution and climate problems for a long time, for almost 30 years. And so air pollution causes 4 to 7 million premature deaths per year worldwide, and 20% of these are children under the age of 5 years old. In the United States, it's about 60 to 65,000 premature deaths and hundreds of thousands to millions of illnesses from cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, complications from asthma. So we're trying to eliminate that problem as well, which is caused primarily by a combination of fossil fuel and biofuel combustion. And global warming, of course, is this looming, growing problem that's also expected to cost on the order of $25 to $30 trillion per year by 2050. And air pollution is already costing on the order of $20 to $25 trillion per year today worldwide. And then the other issue is that fossil fuels are limited resources. Eventually they will run out and costs will rise, and that can lead to social, political, and economic instability, which we need to avoid before it happens. And it is already happening in some places where you have shortages. So these are all drastic problems that require drastic solutions. And our solution is to electrify everything or provide direct heat where the electricity or the heat is provided entirely by wind and water and solar power. So we don't include things like coal with carbon capture, advanced biofuels, or nuclear power. It's not because we have something against it. It's just that we only have a certain amount of money to spend, and we want it to spend it most efficiently. And we've analyzed all these technologies, and they're just not as good. I mean, even like natural gas with carbon capture, it's still like 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour with carbon capture, because you have to mine and transport the gas, and you don't capture all the gas, and it just takes energy for all the whole processes. And in fact, the Department of Energy finds 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, and that compares to like a wind turbine, including its manufacture with today's electricity grid, it's like less than 10 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So why would you spend the same amount of money on something that emits 30 times more pollution? So that's an issue. It's not even the same amount. I mean, the costs are another issue. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to focus on what we are covering, which is wind and water and solar. But we want to electrify all energy. So that's transportation, heating, cooling, industry, and then provide that electricity with clean, renewable energy. So for example, well, for transportation, we'd use primarily battery electrics, but also some hydrogen fuel cell where the hydrogen is produced from electricity. And that would be mostly for long-distance ships, trucks, trains, barges, and things like that. And I'll show you some examples and some military equipment. For heating, cooling, we would use heat pumps for water and air heating, and air conditioning and refrigeration. Heat pumps do not create heat or cold. They move heat and cold, and they use 1/4 on the average, 1/4 the energy as conventional heaters, even compared to electric resistance heaters. So if we go to heat pumps, we reduce power demand significantly worldwide. Industry, we'd have to electrify these high temperature processes as well. Well, 1/3 of industry is already electric, but we have to electrify the rest with arc furnaces, induction furnaces, dielectric heaters. And then we'd provide this electricity for all these sectors with onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, geothermal, some small amounts of tidal and wave power, and existing hydroelectric. We don't expect hydro will grow very much, but if it does, that's fine. But if it doesn't, we try to anticipate it not growing. Then, so I'm going to give some examples of some of these technologies before I move on. So this is an induction, well, on the right is an induction furnace, and the left is an electric arc furnace. These are existing technologies that can be used for high temperature production in industry. So some recent developments, long distance electric semis. Well, on the left is an electric semi Tesla produces. On the right, Nikola 1 is a hydrogen fuel cell semi. And these are existing technologies that are being commercially sold. The bottom left are Proterra electric buses. These are existing and being implemented. In fact, I think China's already installed about 60,000 electric buses. I think they do 60,000 a month. It's like just mass produced right now. On the bottom right, hydrogen fuel cell electric hybrid buses. They've been around in California for at least 10 years. Not a lot, but they've been around, and there are a lot of hydrogen fueling stations as well. Oh, great. That's awesome. So I have a student who's in the Army, and his project for his PhD is to look at how to electrify the entire Army, tanks and all military vehicles, helicopters, marine vessels. And so already he's come up with data on how to electrify. For example, these are like the Abrams M1 tank and Bradley tank. And you can see on the right is if you converted these tanks to battery electric, then on the right is the volume of the tank. It would be about the same. And with tanks, you have to have a constraint because they have to fit over certain bridges, and go through certain tunnels and things like that. And so you can't have them different volumes. So they can be the same volume, and the mass is either slightly, maybe 20% greater mass at the most, but in some cases, some of these vehicles, it's pretty much the same mass as well. And so that's with battery electrics, and then this is if you do hydrogen fuel cell, then it can even be less volume in some cases, more volume in others, but less mass in most cases as well. So anyway, the point is that you can electrify pretty much any transportation or use hydrogen fuel cells for any transportation. And we've looked at the same for like the Boeing 747 as well, and find that it's feasible. And there are aircraft companies building electric aircraft and hydrogen fuel cell aircraft. So for example, on the left here is an existing battery electric aircraft that can go up to 1,500 kilometers, but it only seats, I think, 2 people. On the bottom right is a hydrogen fuel cell aircraft that seats 4 people that can go up to 1,500 kilometers. On the top right is a drawing of a hydrogen aircraft that might have larger volume because you need a larger fuselage because hydrogen is less dense than jet fuel, but as a result, it weighs less. So you have greater volume, less mass, so you have a similar overall drag. But there are companies like Ampere and others that are plan to produce electric aircraft that would carry 50 passengers, commercial aircraft that carry 50 passengers up to 1,500 kilometers. Beyond that, you probably need hydrogen fuel cell electric hybrids. Okay, so then here's another example. This is there's a startup in Silicon Valley that's building these vertical takeoff and landing machines to replace helicopters as well. Although you could, as we showed, just replace a helicopter with something similar. Now, we want to electrify everything, so that includes annoying leaf blowers, which not only smell because of the gasoline they're burning without a catalytic converter, and also due to the noise. And so, actually, I have somebody does my gardening, and he has an electric one of these, and you don't smell it, you don't hear it. It's great. And so now I don't hate leaf blowers anymore. But lawnmowers are the same. You can replace them with electric lawnmowers or existing technologies, forklifts, everything. So this is the idea, is to electrify everything. And there are new technologies, or say new, they're commercially available now, including floating offshore wind, which is really relevant here offshore Connecticut, and floating offshore solar. There's already, as of this year, I think there's already 1 gigawatt installed worldwide of floating offshore solar, mostly on lakes and reservoirs, a lot of them in Asia. And there is already one floating offshore wind farm off the coast of Great Britain, which has a capacity factor of 67%, at least in the first year of operation, or at least first, I don't know if it was a full year, but which is incredible, which means that of the maximum power it possibly can generate, it's actually generating 67% of that. Normally a wind turbine on average onshore in the US has a 33% or so capacity factor. So that's pretty good, and because winds offshore are pretty regular. But this means you can actually take turbines way offshore so people don't see them and don't complain about them anymore. And while the East Coast has relatively shallow water out to 200 miles, the West Coast gets pretty deep pretty fast in most places, so that's where this would really have an advantage or be useful. And it will also be useful here too, because it is pretty expensive, even if it's not deep water. Just the deeper it is, the more expensive it is to put in these turbines. So when you have floating turbines, that reduces the cost. So the cost of offshore wind have come down substantially just in the last 2 years. And now, in some cases, they're between 6 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. It used to be like 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So we'll need storage for our system, because wind and water and solar, or a lot of those technologies I discussed, are intermittent, or variable. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. But our storage is going to not only be electricity storage, but also heat and cold storage. So for electricity, we'd use concentrated solar power with storage, pumped hydroelectric power, where you have 2 reservoirs, a lower and an upper one. And when you have excess electricity, you pump water up the hill. When you need the electricity, you let the water drain down the hill and run a turbine. So in fact, Los Angeles County has a plan now, and they're actually trying to put it in motion, to convert Hoover Dam into one giant pump storage facility. Basically, they take Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam as the upper reservoir, and then there's another lake 20 miles downstream is the second reservoir. So instead of letting the water go once through the turbines, they're going to build pipes or take pipes underground from the lower reservoir back to the upper reservoir, and then pump the water back up the hill, and it's going to cost on the order of $3 to $4 billion to do this. So, but this will be a great way because California, as I mentioned, has a goal to go to 100% renewable energy now, and so it'll need some additional storage to do that, and along with batteries and existing hydroelectric dams, which are nice forms of storage or peaking power already, more pumped hydro like this could help. But when we electrify everything, we can actually take advantage of other types of storage that is not electricity storage. For example, heat and cold storage, heat storage in rocks underground and in water, and cold storage in ice and in water. And I'll show you some examples in a second. And then hydrogen is a form of storage that we'll need for transportation, for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And so when you have excess wind or solar, you can dump it into producing hydrogen. And then also to help balance supply and demand on the grid, demand response, where utilities give people incentives to not use electricity at certain times of the day. And that's by, for example, giving you a much lower rate at night to charge your car than during the day when you have peak time of electricity use. So that's a pretty straightforward way to balance demand on the grid. So let me give you some examples of these types of heat and cold storage. Well, Stanford used to have an ice cube under a building from 1998 to 2015, and had a big ice cube under a building, and during the night, when the electricity price was low, it would use the electricity to produce ice. And then during the day, instead of running air conditioning at the peak time of the day at high prices, it would just run water through the coils in the ice and send the water to the buildings to cool the buildings. So this is like electricity storage, except it's cold storage because it avoids electricity use. But instead of costing, well, right now batteries are $200 a kilowatt hour, and they used to back in 1998 they were probably like $2,000 a kilowatt hour. But this costs $38 a kilowatt hour for this ice storage, and this is actually pretty common. Most people don't know about it, but it's used a lot in stadiums and in hospitals and in communities around the world. But cold storage, now that we want to go to 100% clean renewable energy, we can use this on a larger scale. I'll explain that because they replaced the whole system with something even more efficient. I mean, well, I shouldn't say even more efficient, just a different system. So this is a community in Okotoks, Canada, which is 1 hour south of Calgary. In 2004 and 5, they built 52 homes in the subdivision, and on the garages of these homes, they put these solar collectors, which is in the top left. And those solar collectors inside had a glycol solution. And during the summer, when the days are long and you actually do get a lot of sunshine in Calgary, that heat, the solution absorbs heat from the sun and then gets piped to this building on the right, where the heat gets transferred to water. The water then gets piped underground under this field, which is a play field in the middle of a community. And that field had been excavated and filled with rocks and pipes for the water. And the water then passes by the rocks, and the hot water passes by the rocks and heats the rocks up to 80 degrees Celsius. Those rocks are heated and stay heated because it's insulated around them until wintertime, when the snow is on the ground 6 months later, like on the bottom left. And that whole system is run in reverse, and that heat supplies 100% of the heating for these 52 homes. And that's called seasonal heat storage in rocks. And as I mentioned, while batteries are $200 a kilowatt hour, this is less than $1 a kilowatt hour for the storage. And in fact, it's closer to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's a range, 5 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. But this is the round trip efficiency is not large. It's like 58% or something like that, compared to batteries, which are, 86% or something like that. But still, it's so cheap, you can just keep collecting the heat and just collect excess heat and store it there, and you'll lose some, but it'll be enough to provide the heating. But this is just a form of district heat. Denmark has 60% of Denmark's on district heat, but a little different than this, or a lot different. There they have water tanks in cities, and the water tanks are heated by a variety of mechanisms, and you could use excess wind or solar to do that. And then instead of having individual homes with local heaters, hot water is piped to buildings for both the domestic hot water and separately for building heat. And so it's a form of district heat, this is, and you can do this on a large scale. And for heating, you can also use, well, heat pumps for like home heating. You can use heat pumps, and that's probably common in some places, maybe here somewhat, where that's a little different from this. The heat pumps are really extracting heat from either air or water or the ground. And where you have extreme weather, you'd want to use a ground source heat pump ideally. So now, it used to be they were very expensive, these heat pumps for heating your home, where you'd extract heat from the ground because you'd have to excavate your whole backyard, and that can get pretty expensive. But now they have technology to vertically drill, where it's just a few inches wide drill that you can go straight down, and it's much cheaper and much less invasive, and it's now pretty much a similar cost as air source heat pumps. There's a company in New York called Dandelion that does this type of heat pumps, and I'm sure there are other companies that will pop up doing that as well. Okay, so let me go back to Stanford again. The question was, why did Stanford get rid of the ice cube? Well, they replaced. Okay, so there was actually a natural gas cogeneration plant right outside my office window for several years, and it would provide 80% of the campus electricity and heat. And in 2015-16, it was bulldozed and replaced by these 2 boilers and a chiller, and an elaborate piping system around the university, and basically, and also 60 megawatts of solar. And I should point out, so before I explain this, I should point out that eliminated 68% of the campus greenhouse gas emissions. And just a couple weeks ago, and I don't even think they've announced this publicly, but Stanford committed to 100% renewable energy and has already bought the remaining solar farms to produce 100% renewable energy. It'll be finished in 2021. So by 2021, Stanford will likely be the first campus in the world to be 100% renewable. And so what's really cool is they've set a good example in this. This is an amazing system with this. It's called SESI. It's a heating cooling system. What they do is, well, on the right, you can see this is the heat and cold demand. If you look at the left of the graph, that would be like January, and the right is December. So during the year, the bright blue is the cold demand of the university. So there's cold demand all year, and the bright red on the bottom is the heat demand on the university. And you can see there's overlapping heat and cold demand. So different parts of the university need hot and cold at the same time. So instead of just producing heat and cold everywhere, what happens is when heat is produced, it releases cold, and when cold is produced, it releases heat. So instead of wasting that excess heat and cold, it's captured and piped back to these boilers and chillers where it's stored. And when you need excess heat or excess cold, heat pumps, electric heat pumps, are used to actually generate the heat to heat the water. So let's say you start from scratch and there's no heating or cooling. Electric heat pumps are used to heat the boilers, and heat pumps are also used to cool the chillers. And it's run on electricity, and then the electricity is from the grid, but they've offset it with the solar that they bought from the Mojave Desert. And so this elaborate piping system has effectively eliminated the need for gas at all on the university. And they also actually have a goal to go to 100% electric transportation for all their university vehicles too by 2025. So things are moving well, and this is consistent with California's goal to go to 100% renewable energy. Okay, but now let me just drill down to what people can do in their own homes. So I'm going to use my own home as an example because I was fortunate to be able to build a home from scratch just a couple of years ago. And I decided to build it with no gas on the property, just all electric, and try to be as sustainable as possible. And so the actual home was built, has a steel structure, and the reason it was steel is because it's prefabricated with 80 to 90% recycled steel. And so they actually produced the steel in a factory, then delivered the steel, one truck, and then the house was then assembled like Legos within like a few days. And well, so I say the house, the frame was assembled. And so that eliminated wood waste on the property and didn't have all this wasted wood. That's usually when you're sawing wood, because most California homes are wood. But anyway, that's not what I want to talk about, but I want to talk about the electricity savings. So it has heat pumps, both for air and water. So this is the air source heat pump that provides air conditioning and heating for the home. It's called ductless mini split because in each zone of the house there's one of these units, and these units don't produce heat or cold. They just move it from the outside. So they extract the heat and the cold from the air outside with the unit on the right. And so, for example, when it's hot in the room and you want to cool down the room, a fan blows heat over these coils inside the left unit, and there's coolant that the heat gets absorbed in. So the coolant absorbs heat from the room, then takes it outside, and then expels it. So that cools the room by just removing the heat. And conversely, when you want to heat a room and it's cold in the room, cold air goes over the coolant. The coolant absorbs the cold and expels it outside, and so the room heats up. So it's just moving heat in and out of the house. And this uses 1/4 the energy as a gas heater or an electric resistance heater or any other kind of heater or air conditioner. It's 1/4 the energy, so it's really efficient. I'll show you how efficient the whole system is in a minute. So this is the water heater. It's also an air source heat pump water heater, but instead of extracting heat from the outside, it's extracting heat from the room it's in, which is a mechanical room. And so the room itself is a couple degrees cooler than the rest of the house, but in the summer that's fine. I just open the door and it just provides extra air conditioning. And so it's basically just moving heat from the room to the water and stores the heat in the water tank. And you can control by a timer on the circulation pump when you send water through the house, and you want to do that with our rate system because we have a tiered rate system. Different times of the day cost different amounts of electricity, so you obviously don't want to use electricity when the price is high. So you want to heat the water when the price is low and move it around the house when the price is low. Anyway, so that's the heat pump water heater, and it costs about the same as a normal other water heater. And I should also point out that the heat pump air conditioner and heater, also the whole system was a similar cost, except I avoided things like the gas hookup fee and gas pipelines, which I'll quantify in a second. For stove, no gas stove, electric induction cooktop, which boils water in half the time as gas, and actually you can control the temperature even better than with gas, and then you can even touch the top of the stove when it's boiling water and it doesn't feel hot. And that's because it's actually not producing heat, it's exciting molecules in the pot, so you need special pots that have iron base or a stainless steel base, and that excites molecules and heats the pot directly, so it's actually more efficient. But people say, well, I bet those pots are really expensive. Actually, no, I bought a dozen of them for like $330 or something. So it's not, the whole system is similar cost, but actually more efficient, looks clean and nice, and less dangerous. And you also don't have pollutants from a gas heater, such as NOx, carbon monoxide, other things, and don't have a risk of your home exploding. So then for the solar, there's rooftop solar. It's about 13.6 kilowatts. And the reason it seems like a large system is because I'm also charging electric cars. And there are batteries in the garage, although I have 4 batteries that are Tesla wall mounts, but my utility, PG&E, that's right, PG&E, only let me turn on 2. Because the inverters are, well, they have this rule, this esoteric rule that they help create. If your inverters are larger than 10 kilowatts, and there are 2 batteries on each inverter, and together they're more than 10 kilowatts, then they have to be able to measure the solar going in to the inverter and the batteries, and they have to be able to separate the solar going in to the inverter from the battery electricity going in through the inverter. And they claim they could not measure that, so therefore I can't have 2 more batteries attached to the grid. But it turns out I only needed 2 batteries, and actually I would actually lose money with my electricity exchanges with the grid if I actually had 4 batteries versus 2 batteries, it turns out, because when you're charging the batteries, you're charging them during the day when the solar is on. And in our rate system, that would be in the morning, all is in the morning. As soon as the sun comes up in the morning, you start charging the batteries. But that's actually at the second tier rate system. There are 3 tiers. The cheapest one is at night between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. when it's dark. The most expensive is in the afternoon, well, between 3 and 9 p.m. And then the middle tier is all other hours. So when you're charging the battery, it's at the second tier. And so you're basically, I could be selling that electricity back to the grid at the middle tier instead of charging my battery. And then I'm using the battery mostly when it's nighttime after 11. And when that's occurred, that's at the least expensive tier. So I'm really charging at a more expensive tier than I'm using it. So it's better to sell it back to the grid and then at the more expensive rate and use it, the electricity from the grid at the cheaper rate. So turns out 2 batteries is actually better for that rate structure. And so they did me a favor because now I'll just save them until the other ones run out. So, and then I have electric cars so I'm charging 2 electric cars. Actually, my son has an electric car and he comes over every weekend. He charges as well. So there are 3 electric cars. And so I'm able to, over the year, well, I'll tell you the year what happened over a year, but I want to show you 7 days in the summer during a hot week. So this is the green is a solar photovoltaic production. This is during 1 week in the summer. The green is photovoltaic production. The light blue is in-home use of electricity from the PV or batteries, including the charging of the batteries. The dark blue at night is just battery use of electricity in the home. And then the red is grid electricity when the batteries have run out, basically. And the 2 spikes of red you see are charging these 2 different cars. One's a Tesla Model S, the 20 kilowatt charge, and the other is the Roadster at 10 kilowatt charge. And so even during this 1 week, there was actually, I sent back to the grid 50% of all the electricity generated, even accounting for all the charging of the vehicles. And so it produced twice as much as it used. On the bottom, I don't know if you can see it, at the bottom there's a little graph that shows the battery charge and discharge rate. It goes from 0 to 100%, but the base is at 50% because there are 2 batteries that are sitting idle. And so it goes down to 50% at night when it's discharging. Then in the morning, when the sun comes up, the first thing that happens is, well, the PV provides in-house electricity and then charges the batteries. So that's why it goes up to 100% pretty quickly on the batteries. Batteries stay dormant during the day, and then as soon as nighttime comes, the batteries are used and they start draining until they're fully drained, or maybe they're not. Okay, so that's 1 week, but here's 1 year of energy use. And this actually was 11 months, not even because I turned it on in May at the end of, well, I turned it on, they only started counting at the end of May, so I actually missed a whole month of sunshine, which I'll capture this year. But regardless, even over 11 months, counting for 1 year of electricity, I generated 120% of all my home and vehicle energy. So I had no electric bill, no gas bill, no gasoline bill. Instead, I received a check for $530 for the excess electricity from my community choice aggregation utility, Silicon Valley Clean Energy. So in California and a lot of other states now, you have an option to have an underlying utility, so in my case is PG&E, which deals with the transmission distribution. And then there are these community choice aggregation utilities that take over the generation portion of your bill. And what they do is if I didn't have any solar on my roof, they would just give you an option of 100% renewable electricity, 80%, some other percent of renewable electricity, and you pay different rates. Turns out their 100% rate is almost the same as PG&E's, whatever regular grid rate. It's like 0.002 cents a kilowatt hour different. So it's hardly any different. But in my case, I'm actually can then sell back to the CCA at the time of use, which is mostly peak times of the day. So I'm selling up to 28 cents a kilowatt hour back to the utility, and which is the same rate I would be paying for that electricity. But PG&E, on the other hand, would only pay me 2 cents a kilowatt hour for my excess electricity at the end of the year. So these CCAs are really good. They're springing up all over the place. Just last week, there was a new one in Los Angeles, and 10 communities actually went all in on them. So there are 10 communities that have committed to 100% renewables just last week in Los Angeles because they just have started a new CCA. And San Diego also committed a few weeks ago to 100% renewable. Well, they've committed to it, but they actually then transferred to a CCA. So I think CCAs are they're really springing up everywhere, and there are at least 20 of them in California alone, and I think there are like 80 of them nationwide. But the other point I want to make about this is by not having gas on the property, I avoided a hookup fee that PG&E was going to charge me of about $6,000, but it ranges depending on your home between $3,000 and $8,000 usually. I did not need pipes in my home. That was another $1,000 to $7,000. Well, in my case, it was probably closer to $5,000, but this is the range. These numbers on in the red are ranges for lots of homes and not just mine, but somewhere in the middle. But most people's electric bills are $1,000 to $3,000 a year, gas bills $1,000 to $3,000 a year, and fuel bills $1,000 to $4,000. So you can theoretically, by electrifying with a new home, you can save $4,000 to $15,000 up front and $3,000 to $10,000 per year in bills. And the cost of my solar and battery system, well, we have subsidies. Well, there's a federal tax credit of 30% still for solar and also wind. And then we have some in-state subsidies as well. But the payback time, and for my system, is about 4 to 5 years. And then it's warranted for 25 years. My solar is warranted for 25 years, and the batteries are warranted for 10. So it's free electricity through 25 years, effectively, after you've paid it back. Now, without any subsidies, it would be about a 10-year payback time. So it's still good. Regardless, we should all want to do this, even if it takes longer to pay back. It's going to pay back eventually. But. Okay, so the next question is, can we actually transition the entire world to 100% clean renewable energy just with this wind and water and solar? So we developed energy plans for 139 countries, and we've also done them for all 50 U.S. states, including Connecticut. And so I want to just discuss some of these, but first start on the world scale. The world power demand, well, these 139 countries represent 99% of the emissions worldwide, and there are a total of 195 countries worldwide. In 2012, the aggregate of these countries' power demand was 12.1 trillion watts, or terawatts. That's expected to go up to about 21 terawatts in 2050. And if we electrify everything and provide the electricity with clean, renewable wind, water, and solar, without heat pumps, that would go down to about 11.8 terawatts. So with heat pumps, down to 8.6 terawatts, or 58%. And so how do we get 58% reduction of power demand, really without changing our habits, just by transitioning? Well, it's because 23 percentage points of that is due to the fact that electricity is more efficient than combustion. And you get most of this benefit in the transportation sector. Gasoline put in your car, only 17 to 20% of the energy in the gasoline goes to move your car, and the rest is waste heat. An electric car, 80 to 86% of the electricity in the car goes to move the car, and the rest is waste heat. So you reduce your power demand in transportation by on the order of 75%, but averaged over all energy sectors, it's 23%. Then 13% of all energy worldwide is used to mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels. And that can be eliminated immediately if you have wind and solar, for example, because the wind comes right to the turbine, the solar comes right to the panel. So when you're looking at comparing, for example, gas and wind even, the price per unit energy, you have to consider that, let's say you have the same price per unit energy and you're going, I don't know which one to pick. Well, consider that, that's not counting the fact that you need all this energy to mine and transport the gas to get it. In fact, in the United States, there are 50,000 new oil and gas wells drilled every year in the U.S. alone. And I'll show you the numbers of how many there actually are and how much land area that takes. So it's not only, this is why when you actually electrify everything, if we're going down 50%, let's say 50% reduction of energy use, even if the cost per unit energy is the same in both cases of a fossil fuel system or a renewable system, you're using 50% less energy. And so consumers will pay directly 50% less. And this is what I see in my own home. This is why it's so cheap and I'm able to make money, is because I'm using so much less energy with the heat pumps, especially in my case. I mean, worldwide, you can get another 16% reduction of demand of power just using heat pumps for everything. And that's averaged over all sectors. I mean, an individual heat pump will reduce the demand 75% compared to electric resistance or a gas heater. Then you can get another 7% energy efficiency improvement beyond business as usual, and that's how we get 58%. So the examples, the next slides I'm going to show are with the 11.8 terawatt number. How can we actually match power demand worldwide to get 11.8 terawatts in 2050? And actually, so everything I'll show you, we can actually do better than that just using heat pumps. Well, first of all, this was for Connecticut. So this is our plan just for Connecticut to go to 100% renewable. And then I'll show you the world one. But this is for all energy sectors by 2050 if you electrify everything. So we project, and by the way, this is just one possible mix. There are several, well, really an infinite number of mixes that I think are feasible, but this is one, with 5% onshore wind, 45% offshore wind, 4% residential rooftop PV, 3.4% commercial government rooftop PV, 41% solar PV power plants, no CSP or geothermal. This hydro represents what's existing in the state, and then a small amount of wave. So that'll get you to 100% for everything. Just if Connecticut was an island, of course Connecticut's not an island, and you do have a regional grid, so you don't need to stick to all these numbers, and you could have a mix. You could have more rooftop PV, for example, less commercial or utility PV. So there's a lot of ways you can trade here. But worldwide, this is the mix overall, 139 countries. 23.5% onshore wind, 14% offshore wind, 16% residential rooftop PV, 12% commercial government, 20% solar PV power plants, 10% CSP, 1% geothermal, 4% hydro, which all exists, and less than 1% tidal and wave. And so the numbers on the right are the numbers of new devices, so that's why we have 0 new hydro. But we'll need 1.6 million 5-megawatt turbines onshore and another 930,000 offshore. So that's 2.6 or 7 million wind turbines, and that might sound like a lot. You might say, oh, that's going to take up a huge amount of land. So this is the land area required for these energy plans. Well, offshore wind doesn't require any new land, and tidal and wave don't either. Rooftop PV does not require any new land, and we're not adding any new hydro. Geothermal is pretty small. So it's just utility PV and CSP and onshore wind that require the land. And for our plans, 0.22% or less than about 1/5 of 1% of the world's land area would be needed for utility PV plus CSP, and about 0.9% for onshore wind. But that onshore wind is mostly space between wind turbines that can be used for agriculture, rangeland, farmland, or even the solar panels as well. So it's multi-purpose land. And it may actually not be that much because, well, first of all, this is based on without using heat pumps. And second of all, we've actually done a more analysis recently looking at land use of wind farms, and they're actually using less land than people had thought before. But let's say in the worst case here, it's 1.1% of the world's land used for converting everything, eliminating the fossil fuel industry, eliminating global warming, eliminating air pollution, providing energy security and jobs. But let's compare that. How much land does the fossil fuel industry take? Because that's what we'll be eliminating. Well, so here's California and the United States. These are the numbers of different fossil fuel infrastructures. So they're in U.S., I'll just give you the U.S. numbers. There are 1.2 million active oil and gas wells, 2.6 million abandoned oil wells, 550,000 abandoned gas wells, 1,500 coal mines, 135 oil refineries, 1.6 million miles of pipeline for gas, 161,000 miles of oil pipeline, 3,360 power plants, 115,000 gas stations, 394 storage facilities. They take up 1.3% of the United States land area and 1.7% of California's land area. So a wind, water, solar system is now looking pretty good compared to the fact that the fossil fuel infrastructure is not only this large, but it's growing every year, and we'll have to maintain it. As I mentioned, 50,000 new oil and gas wells in the U.S. alone every year. We'd have to maintain that forever. And these numbers have increased over time because of the continuous oil and gas mining. I mean, you're not eliminating abandoned oil and gas wells. They're just staying there, and they're still abandoned, filled with concrete, and you can't use a lot of that land for anything else. So, well, the next question is, can we actually keep the grid reliable with just clean, renewable wind and water and solar? So we broke up the world into 20 regions, the 139 countries into 20 regions, and we did grid stability analyses for each region, and we looked at 3 different storage scenarios. In case A, these are the 3. Case A, we had batteries, CSP with storage, heat and cold storage, no heat pumps, no added hydropower turbines to existing dams, and we had hydropower storage, pumped hydropower storage, and hydrogen for transportation. Case B was the same except no batteries, and we did add hydropower turbines to replace batteries. So just adding additional turbines to existing dams to increase the peak discharge rate of the water from the dams without changing the annual average water flow. And this was instead of batteries. And in case C, we added batteries again, but we had no heat or cold storage. Instead, just used heat pumps for everything with instantaneous power, no added hydropower turbines. Anyway, all three of these scenarios we ran across all 20 world regions. The average world cost was 10.6 to 10.7 cents a kilowatt hour, so it's pretty consistent. But you'll notice the demand reduction in each case, in the first two cases, was 42.5% reduction because we did not use heat pumps. In the second case is 58% reduction. So even though the cost per unit energy is the same, we use less energy in the third case, so it's actually cheaper to consumers. But they're all pretty good, and you're going to get the actual reality will be somewhere in between all these scenarios. But let me just show you case A for all 20 world regions really quickly. So this is because to do this, we did every 30 seconds for 5 years in all these regions, predicting the winds and solar radiation fields, and then comparing the intermittent supply of energy with the intermittent demand for energy and storage and demand response. So the red line here is the supply, the intermittent supply of wind and solar mostly. Blue is demand plus changes in storage plus losses in shedding. This shows a 30-day period every hour. As I mentioned, we did 5 years every 30 seconds. But you can see the supply is matching demand continuously. And this is in North America plus Canada as one big grid. This is Central America. Here's Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, South America, New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, Mongolia, North Korea, Russia, Georgia, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Central Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Iceland, and Africa. So that's all 139 countries. And so here's a summary. If we just look at the fossil fuel business as usual case in the electric power sector as it is today, but marched forward to 2050, so not electrifying all sectors, the cost of fossil fuels, the direct energy cost brought back to today's dollars is about 9.8 cents a kilowatt hour, but the health cost is 13 and the climate cost is 16 cents a kilowatt hour. Total 38 cents a kilowatt hour is the social cost of energy, which economists pay attention to, compared to just the wind, water, solar in today's electric power sector marched forward is 9.7. So the social cost of energy in the fossil fuel case is 4 times that of the wind, water, solar case. But again, we're using 50% fewer kilowatt hours. So the social cost to consumers for the fossil fuel case is 8 times that with wind, water, solar. In other words, if you switch to wind, water, solar, it's going to be 1/8 the social cost to consumers and 1/2 the direct energy cost to consumers compared to the fossil fuels. Now, all energy sectors, it's 10.6 cents a kilowatt hour in the wind, water, solar case. It's just because the other sectors are a little more expensive than the direct electricity sector. Okay, so let's then turn to policy and what is it? What do people think about these energy plans? What has been done so far? So there have been a couple of public opinion surveys. One was last November. It was 13 countries, 26,000 people took part in the survey, including in the US and Canada. But it's interesting, 82% of the people surveyed said they wanted a world with 100% renewable energy. That's not more renewable energy, that's 100%. That's 8 out of 10 people in the world, if this is statistically accurate, want 100% renewable energy, which is amazing. But what's kind of scary is only 66% of the same people believe climate change is a significant problem. The only good news about that is that you don't have to believe in climate change to believe in clean renewable energy, which is fine. If you don't have to believe in the problem, as long as you want to solve it, that's fine. But what is the reason for that? Well, 69% of the people said renewables make countries more energy independent. 73% say renewables will boost economic growth. There's others, and jobs as well. So there are a variety of reasons people like renewable energy that don't necessarily believe in that climate change is a significant problem. Here's a similar poll that was just in the US and several states that found 64% strongly supported the contention that the U.S. should go to entirely clean and renewable sources like wind, solar, and hydro by 2050. That means homes, businesses, cars, and trucks. Another 19% somewhat supported that. So a total of 83% strongly or somewhat supported going to 100% renewable energy in the U.S. across these 7 states. So this is pretty consistent with the other poll. Surprisingly, this is a completely independent, different time period poll. In the U.S., there are several resolutions pending in the House and also in the Senate. Maybe the House ones could actually be voted on now, to go to 100% renewable energy. There's a House Resolution 540 that has 60 co-sponsors that calls for the United States to support a transition to 100% clean renewable energy. There's a Senate resolution for a similar thing. There's Senate Bill 987 to transition from fossil fuels to 100% clean and renewable energy by 2050. And there are actually 2 House bills that are pending, HR 3314 and 3671, that one calls for 100% by 2050 and the other is 100% by 2035. So these are literally sitting in Congress waiting to be voted on. But actual laws that have been passed include Hawaii, a 100% renewable electricity law by 2045, California, a similar one by 2045 with 60% by 2030. Vermont, actually more aggressive, 75% renewable electricity by 2032. This is on the books. New York has a 50% renewable electricity law by 2030. Well, Washington State, it hasn't passed this one. Actually, I mentioned Nevada did pass a 50% renewable one, but I think they actually have to vote on it one more time for it to actually become part of the Constitution. There are over 110 cities now and counties in the United States alone, but also there's some in Canada in addition that have committed to 100% renewables, and you can see a bunch here. And some large ones like Atlanta, Georgia, and Portland, Oregon, and Madison, Wisconsin, and San Diego and San Francisco. But there are also a lot of small towns like Boone and Silva, North Carolina. They have city councils that have voted like 5-0 to go to 100% renewables. And in fact, we have like 12 towns and counties in North Carolina alone that have committed. And this Sierra Club has helped a lot in getting these commitments. But then there are 154 companies that have also committed to 100% clean renewable energy, including the major companies of the world. And Apple and Google claim they've already reached it and surpassed that. And Google now says it wants to not only be 100% in the annual average, which all these commitments are for the annual average, but to actually hour by hour they want to be 100%, and they're at least in their data centers. And then there are over 70 nonprofits that have supported 100% renewable energy, and this is really kind of driving this movement. All these nonprofits getting together and informing people about what's possible and engaging the public. And, well, so if I want to summarize, I didn't talk about jobs, but we did analyze the job creation in all 139 countries in all 50 states. And we find that worldwide we can create 24 million more long-term full-time jobs than lost. In the U.S., it's about 2 million more. We would require only 0.1% of land for footprint for solar PV and CSP with these world energy plans, and 0.9% for spacing between wind turbines. We'd avoid 4 to 7 million air pollution deaths per year. We could slow, then eventually reverse global warming. We think we can keep the grid stable throughout the world with 100% renewables. The cost per kilowatt hour is slightly less than that of fossil fuels, but that's the energy cost. But the health plus energy plus climate costs are per kilowatt hour 1/4 that of fossils, and the absolute energy plus health plus climate costs are 1/8 because we're using 50% less energy with the wind, water, solar system. Finally, transitioning to 100% in all energy sectors, we think is technically and economically possible. The main barriers are social and political. The solution does require collective willpower of everybody, and we can't just do it in isolation with a few examples. Everybody has to help, or at least want to help. And I'll just point out, if you're interested in slides such as this, here's some links. I don't know if you can copy this down, but there are the roadmaps or the actual papers that we've developed over the last decade on these 100% renewable energy plans. And then we also have grid studies that are available that have been published. And if you go to the solutionsproject.org, you can actually find infographic maps. So you can click on a state or country, and up should pop a plan, or at least there's some on the side of there's some PDF files you can get that summarize in an infographic the state or country plan at the solutionsproject.org. And we have a subgroup called 100.org that it's a group part of the Solutions Project that tries to engage cities and communities throughout the U.S. And then also I post new information, new slides on Twitter quite a bit. So anyway, if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Thank you very much.
And first, I would like to invite Bernie Pelletier. Bernie is Vice President of PACE, and Bernie leads the project called 100% CT. And he's going to give you a bit of an explanation of that project.
Okay, very quickly, I'm going to spend 10 minutes on the 100% CT project. You heard from Mark Jacobson that we can power the world with wind, water, and solar. We're going to show you how we want to do that here in Connecticut, town by town. I want to start off in this era, in this political era. We're tempted sometimes to say, we can't do great things. And that's a tragedy, because I want to just show you the Erie Canal of all things. 1808, it was proposed. 1825, it was finished. Who did that? 2 lawyers, a math teacher, and a baby engineer. That was the people who were responsible for that. They were the project engineers of that. It's only 363 miles long, 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, dug by hand with technology that didn't exist when they started. If we can do that, we can do this. That's the bottom line. And just to bring it up to today's times, was it supported by the then President Madison? No. He told DeWitt Clinton, this is your big ditch, do it without me. Sort of sounds like today. What is our project? Our project has 5 steps. Benchmark our current energy use, town by town. In all the places we've gone, when you go to a town and say, do you know how much your town uses? Most people can say, yes, we do. Do you know how much your residents use? Nobody can answer that. Do you know how much your businesses use? Nobody has to answer that. We address all uses in the town. Step 2, and Mark talked about this, this is actually a crucial, important, and overlooked step. We have to reduce our energy use. The phrase we use is reduce, then produce. This is called the ecospace, but I'd ask you, take a look at the ceiling. Is it insulated? No. So we're confident that we can do a lot better without even trying too hard. Step 3 is what everybody thinks we need to do, and we do, of course, need to do this, which is look for local generation. And we spend our time here mostly looking at solar. There's a little bit of hydro, and of course we're enthused to the max about what we can do with offshore wind. By the way, I want to tell you that on the PACE table there and on the table out there is a handout for these slides. So on the way out, grab that if you want to remember. We know, to quote Scotty on Star Trek, the grid, she can't handle much more. Distributed energy. And so we do have a grid typology that we call a community microgrid. But more important to what we have, and you're going to hear a little bit of this from our panel, is Connecticut itself, working with the utilities, has got a grid modernization product underway, which will enable us to host a lot more solar and make our electric supply a lot more resilient. And finally, we have to make this happen. Mark talked about the idea of political will, social will, and we have some great partners helping us take this idea and push it out to engage with people, to educate people, to enable people to do what we have to do. This is an actual town that we did. It's in eastern Connecticut. Begins with M, and they have an unnatural attachment to husky dogs. But this is our benchmarking sort of single slide. If you look at, there's 4 light blue bars. The first one's electricity. The second one is natural gas. The utilities actually give us the actual consumption for that town, and so those are actual numbers. The next little blue bar up is oil heat, and the one after that is transportation. So that is the entire use of that particular town. It's $687 gigawatt hours. Most people don't know that Giga is actually Lady Gaga's younger sister. So we have 687 gigawatts there. I won't go into any detail, but Mark talked about the various ways that we can knock that load down. So we have 3 bars down, which really represent adoption of heat pumps, adoption of electric vehicles, and general conservation using insulation in buildings like this. Very quickly, this is a repetition of that, and Mark showed much more compelling slides than this. I just want to draw your attention to something that's crucial in the Northeast, which is Mark built his house from scratch, new construction, anywhere. We can do that net zero. I bet you there's people in this room who know somebody that has a net zero house. If we were ever able to do a deep energy retrofit and make it commercially viable, that would change our game independent of wind, water, and solar. So there's a lot we can do, and there's things that will be coming down the pike. To talk a little bit about how much could we site locally, we have engaged with a firm called Helioscope, so we can actually do solar modeling. If anybody's curious how much you can site on a particular location, by all means get in touch with us. These are just sort of pictures to go through quickly. On farmland, next to farmland. The one on the right there is Simsbury High School, where we modeled solar on that. And of course, the carport. Whenever I go anywhere, and last night I was in downtown Hartford, you see all those open parking lots? What a waste. We could cover them, they'd generate power, and they would keep us from the elements. People who have driven north towards Springfield out of Hartford know that there's what they call Mount Trashmore. It's a covered landfill. A third of it is covered with solar. We've modeled that you could easily triple that amount of solar. Just as an example, opportunities are laying there, waiting to be taken. Another one, this is a little bit more esoteric perhaps. If you take the busway, or if you don't like the busway, take the train tracks. Anytime you have an open right-of-way, it could be utility right-of-way, it could be a busway, it could be a big highway, it could be along a highway. I just took the busway from Flatbush Avenue to Hamilton Street and said, let's cover it over. Same deal. Lots of power, and it shelters us from the weather. We could literally spend hours on this topic, but this is our community microgrid. I would ask you to take a few things away from it. Our grid now, if you look at that gray box, that's the substation, and everything that hangs in back of that substation right now. If that substation gets a red X, everything in back of that falls. Our architecture, which we took from Clean Coalition, which is a Palo Alto company, essentially does 3 things. They segregate the grid so you can switch off pieces of it. See those pink dotted lines? In every one of the pink dotted lines, they cite a little bit of renewable energy, and they cite a little bit of energy storage. So if the big grid goes down, they can keep on chugging. This is being done already in California. People say, Bernie, Mark, you can't possibly afford this. Based on our analysis, we can. We use an immense amount of energy now, and it costs us an immense amount of money. We estimate for this particular town they spend, residents, business, municipality, $52 million a year. We think we could buy the necessary infrastructure for about $30 million a year, spread over 20 years. Local outreach, just to very quickly mention our partners. The Sierra Club, Ready for 100, they're building local will and enthusiasm. Clean Water Action is involving this project in their 60 some odd task forces and municipalities. We work with CHISPA, League of Conservation Voters, Posigen, and Eastern Connecticut Green Action. We'd love, consider this as an invitation, we'd love to, if you haven't worked with us already, get with Mark and me after this, and let's do some business. We can do this. What's required for success is the creation of ever broader coalitions. We're starting that right here today. What's needed is not moderation or even necessary compromise, but effective stories that appeal to widely held beliefs about ourselves. That's from Governing Magazine, the May edition. Our story, and you heard this from Mark, our story, this is possible, it's affordable, there's money to be made, it will save lives, it will save the planet, it will make us resilient, and it will make us self-reliant. This is our Erie Canal. And lest you forget, we're all the people that we have all been waiting for. Thanks so much.
We have a tremendous panel here. If I were trying to, well, I did try a while back and say, who would I want to have here to talk about doing this in Connecticut? This is the group, and we were able to get all of them. So we've got a tremendous breadth, diversity, and depth of practical experience, of knowledge, of expertise. So without further ado, let's get started with the panel discussion. What when you look at the issue of getting to 100%, as we saw from Mark's presentation, there is a wide range of different topics you could touch on. And we've got 4 panelists. We're going to give them each a chance to do some prepared comments. We'll talk a bit amongst ourselves. And then after we've done that, we want to open it up for questions. And I hope we can stay on track so we'll have lots of time for people to ask questions, because I'm sure they're out there. So let me start with Mary Sotos. Mary is Deputy Commissioner for Energy at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, or DEEP. She was appointed to this position in February of 2017. Before joining DEEP, Mary led renewable energy and greenhouse gas accounting at World Resources Institute, a highly respected Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit organization. Mary graduated from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, with a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and a concentration in social sciences. On a Fulbright fellowship, she pursued graduate coursework in science and environmental management at the Université Libre de Brussels in Belgium. Mary, thank you. Well, you could give us a sense of sort of where Connecticut is, what we've gotten to, what we've already committed to.
Does this work? Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So first, not everyone here may know about the state agency that I work for, so Energy and Environmental Protection. So we take an integrated approach to energy planning in the state. When we think about, big commitments like what we were hearing about today, I think the good news from my perspective is there are already some building blocks that we have in place to sort of address many of these different aspects. So to just sort of frame how we've been thinking about it, the first thing is climate. So we're looking at this through a climate lens. And actually all of the panelists here, we're all part of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. So that's a group that was tasked with coming up with an interim target. So the state already has a target for 2050 to reduce emissions in the state by 80%, but we knew we needed something in the near term to help us stay on track for that. So that group went through a modeling exercise to both propose and thankfully succeeded legislatively in putting a 2030 carbon reduction target across all sectors in place. So based on that target, we also looked at what's called a wedge analysis. So what would we have to do in the state in transportation, home heating, and in the electric sector to actually meet that goal? And I think I'll focus a little bit. I think the home heating pieces I found particularly interesting today because there's such variety, right, in the ways that we can more efficiently achieve home heating and cooling. One of the challenging parts of thinking about how do we make that transformation in Connecticut is that about half of homes in Connecticut are currently heated by delivered fuels. So that both is a reflection of, sort of where the building stock is, the capital, investment that it would take to make that transformation, but also a reflection, politically. Like if everyone in this group is interested in making that change, there's a vested interest in resisting that. So something for us to keep in mind as we think about new ways to approach that. I think in terms of making the, as we were hearing before, the older housing stock in Connecticut more efficient, we do have programs in the state that focus on providing opportunities for you to get a home energy audit. Those funds, we all pay for the ability to do those that kind of work through our energy bills. There's a little charge on your energy bill that goes towards incentivizing that through paying for rebates. I think a key question would be, how can we use that program to help forward this kind of transformation? But I just wanted to make sure we mentioned that, because that's also a program that the funding was, part of that funding was diverted to plug holes in the state budget. So if that's a priority for you, that's something that we think about, is how can we make sure there's a sustainable funding source to help, again, make our buildings more efficient so that they're using less energy to begin with. When we did the GC3 wedge analysis, I think the opportunity for air and ground source heat pumps became very clear. And the GC3 had the sort of same electrify everything approach. As I look through the room and think of all the great advocates that are here, I see a huge opportunity to increase consumer awareness about these new ways to heat and cool homes. I think most customers, especially those who are used to an oil system, may not even be familiar with all the different new technologies. So again, a huge opportunity for customer awareness, for, I think I saw on one of the slides, like a solarize, thermalize. But also when we think about, so that's on the home heating side. But just to talk briefly about where we see it going on the electric side, a couple good news stories are that we actually have a 40% renewable portfolio standard now. 40% of the state's energy will be from renewable sources by 2030. A portion of that comes from programs that we have in state for solar for residential, commercial facilities, but the state, my office actually has the authority to go out and run RFPs for large utility scale projects. So we've been doing that over the last several years very successfully. That kind of competition has helped bring down the price of those projects. Offshore wind is a huge opportunity. We just bought our first 200 megawatts or so of an offshore wind project that will be serving you, Connecticut customers. So I think, we have these building blocks in place. We have funds for efficiency. We have the GC3 analysis. We have authority to continue to procure renewable energy. One of the biggest challenges I think we would need to confront from an energy planning perspective is the nuclear energy in state. So we can talk more about that on this panel, but sort of the long-term replacement vision for that energy, which is helping us from a carbon perspective today, but if long-term replacement with zero carbon renewable energy is needed, I think that's part of what we're thinking. How do we plan that transition?
Mary, we've got a lot of people here who work very passionately with a lot of grassroots organizations, through their schools, through their clean energy task forces. How can people here today sort of help you in sort of helping make these things happen?
That's a great question. So, I think, as I'm thinking about how do we foster more renewable energy, distributed renewable energy throughout the state. So that's one piece that I think ties in well with sort of local efforts. I'll highlight that, a number of our new programs for distributed renewables, they're in a process right now at PURA, so I won't talk too much about them, to go through some restructuring, to sort of find what's the new successor of these programs. But one of the things we heard pretty clearly from municipalities was that they needed more opportunity for doing solar locally. So we think we have a new pathway for that. So if you want to talk more about that afterwards, we can do that. But that would be an opportunity, I would say, if through the clean energy task forces and other, if you have the will locally to do renewables, to be more efficient. I think the state does have programs in each of those areas. So part of it's just, working with us to help those programs better and meet the needs that you're seeing locally.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. Our next panelist is Katie Dykes. I was thrilled that Katie was able to take part, in part because as chair of PURA, the Public Utility Regulatory Authority, we weren't sure if Katie would really be able to say anything. So we're thrilled that she could be here. The topic that we've really asked Katie to focus on is one that she is allowed to speak on in public, and that is grid modernization. As we know, we can't just keep adding renewables to the grid as it's constituted. So there is a docket in front of Pura that Katie is actively involved in. Katie, as I said, is the chair of Pura. She was nominated by Governor Daniel Malloy to serve as Pura commissioner on October 27th, 2016. She previously served in Mary's role as deputy commissioner for energy at DEEP. She held that position since March of 2012. Pura operates under the leadership of 3 commissioners and is statutorily charged with regulating the rates and services of Connecticut's investor-owned electricity, natural gas, water, and telecommunication companies. That's a very wide remit. And is the franchising authority for state's cable television companies. Katie served as chair of the board of directors of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, from 2014 to 2017. This is a multi-state effort focused on reducing carbon emissions from electric generating facilities. She also represents Governor Malloy on the board of managers of the New England States Committee on Electricity. Katie joined DEEP in 2012 after prior service as Deputy General Counsel for the White House Council on Environmental Quality and as a legal advisor to the General Counsel for the U.S. Department of Energy. She's a graduate of Yale College and the Yale Law School. And as we mentioned, the main topic we asked Katie to address today is grid mod. Thanks, Katie.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think that there is always a fear with utility commissioners that we really can't talk about anything, and we do have a lot of dockets, a lot of things underway. When we have something that's in a docket, of course, we can't talk about it outside of the hearing room. So one of the things I do want to encourage you all to do is to come to our hearing room, and that's why I was so glad to get this invitation, because I think as a utility commissioner, it's important that we get out and talk more, so we let people know what our process is. A lot of people may not be familiar with it, may not know what a utility commission does, but as we see, listening to Professor Jacobson's presentation, the theme here is electrify everything. And the modern grid that we have 2 electric utilities in the state. When we think about the framework, what they're going to be building for to maintain a reliable system at a reasonable cost for ratepayers, and adding in supplying power for cars and for heating and cooling homes on the scale that's necessary to achieve this transformation, then we have a lot of work that's going to be going on in our hearing room to make sure that the utilities are delivering on that opportunity. So pleased to be here. We did launch a docket last December. It's investigating the distribution system planning of the electric utilities, and we waived the ex parte rules in that case because it's an investigation. We wanted to be able to get out and get the word out and hear from folks at gatherings like this. So this is a little bit of a departure from the typical rules, but it's a really exciting docket. We anticipate we'll be issuing a decision in January that will tee up what the next sort of opportunity areas are to focus on. But what we're really, one of the things that we're looking at in this docket is taking into account the carbon goals that we have in the state of an 80% reduction by 2050, the requirement that's implied within that to electrify these different sectors of heating and transportation. That's just one of the facets that we're thinking about. Well, how do the utilities prudently manage the investments to be able to supply power for those new needs? And there's a real great opportunity here. Some of you may be aware, we have the unfortunate distinction of being one of the states with the highest electric distribution rates in the continental U.S. It doesn't make me very popular, but so cost is a really, really important one of the predominant concerns that we have. And how do we make this transformation while continuing to provide affordable electric service for customers? Some low-income customers in our state may be paying 30% of their monthly income for utility bills. And we see the number of customers who are having challenges paying those bills continuing to increase. So it is absolutely critical, especially if we want to be a model for those states who may not have taken action on climate yet, to show that we can achieve this transformation and do it in a really prudent manner. That's what we're good at here in Connecticut, to make sure that this is a transformation that works for everyone in our society, and that it can support a thriving economy and help those who have the least resources. So there's a real opportunity here. If you think about, the utilities, mostly the costs of maintaining the system are fixed costs. They have to build out the poles and wires to be able to supply power at the peak need that we anticipate that customers will have. But that system that they've built out, of course, is not fully loaded all the time. In fact, the load factor is, is probably about 50% on average that system is being used because people's power usage goes down at night and it peaks in the afternoon. So if we think about adding all these new loads, cars, air source heat pumps, et cetera, we have a real opportunity or we could have a real challenge. The real opportunity is if we can ensure that the times when those new loads are being pulling power are optimized to when we aren't normally loading up the grid. So, for example, ensuring that these new electric vehicles that are coming online are going to be charged at night instead of in the afternoon. Then we could end up in a place where the utilities are selling more electricity and utilizing the same, as much as possible, the current footprint of the grid. And that could have an ameliorative effect on rates, which would make me look like a hero. But if we don't have, really prudent and thoughtful planning and strategic planning about how to design rates and how to design investment, we could end up with a nightmare scenario that people are, acquiring these new loads and they're plugging them all in the afternoon at that peak time, and then the utilities will need to build out the system to be able to accommodate all that charging load cutting on the same time. So I just give you that as a tiny appetizer because I know we don't have much time and we want to hear from everyone, but of some of the things that we're thinking about now of how to prepare and have to have a prudent regulatory framework to ensure that we get the opportunity, which is affordable electricity service that is accommodating these and helping to achieve these new carbon goals, but trying to avoid the unfortunate scenario that would result if we're not thinking ahead to how to do this in the right way. So please get involved in our docket. It's docket 1712-03. I know there are a number of groups that are participating, and so I just appreciate the opportunity to be here today and look forward to the questions.
Great, thanks, Katie. Environmental organizations and environmental advocates are often perceived as very much anti-utility and sort of yelling at the utilities, but this transformation that has to happen, it has to work for the utilities as well, right? They are key partners, and I don't know, this is a topic that is much broader than we can handle today. There have been whole conferences dedicated to it, but are you optimistic that we'll get to that hopeful scenario where we can transition in a way that doesn't spook the utilities and gives them unleashes some of the opportunities that this new energy economy offers them?
Yeah, I think we have to take an integrated approach, and I think that it's really important that, when you asked the question of Mary earlier, I mean, to the extent that people are here, I mean, it's great to see all this participation, people interested in how to achieve these different pathways. You're talking about it in your communities, you're talking about it at your schools, you're talking about it to your neighbors. Being aware of our job, if we're not communicating to you, here are some of the issues that we have to, work around. Here are some of the challenges the utility may face. Here are some of the options. These may be more costly. If we can do these are less costly. This is going to be a problem in terms of reliability. It's really important as regulators. We have the utilities involved in all of our proceedings. We need to hear from stakeholders too, and they need to hear what the utilities engineers' concerns are, for example, about it being able to accommodate these loads. If everyone's communicating and everyone's sharing, okay, here's what I want, here are my challenges, then we are going to be on a much better path. It's when we're not talking to each other or we're not approaching this planning in a really integrated manner, not listening to each other, that we start to talk past each other and miss these opportunities. So I just say that at a really high level, but that's why I really encourage people to be aware of what these processes are. These will be great investment opportunities potentially for the utilities. You are all customers of the utilities, and to the extent that they're, I think, probably wondering, just as we are at the Utility Commission, when are all these EVs going to show up? When are all these heat pumps going to show up? This turns so much, electrifying these two sectors, more so than the electric sector, turns on individual customer decisions across the entire state of Connecticut. It's not like a grid planner somewhere is deciding to build a new power plant. This is, over 1 million people deciding whether they want to spend, replace their furnace with a heat pump, or, their car dies and it's time for an EV. And it's anybody's guess about when customers are going to make those choices. So you all have great insights into how to spread that word and how to accelerate that transformation as customers and people who are tapped into these communities.
Mark, did you want to comment here on, I know every state's different, but you've seen this in California, you've seen it elsewhere. Or do you want to come back to it? Okay, do that. We'll keep on track. Great. Thank you, Katie. So next is John Humphreys. John is known to most of us. He has more than 2 decades of experience in nonprofit management, community organizing, and advocacy, and has served as organizer for the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs since its establishment in 2012. His organizing experience encompasses local, state, regional, and national campaigns working with people in rural Appalachian communities affected by coal mining, a coalition of labor, religious, and community organizations in the Naugatuck Valley. I could go on and on. With training in water resources, engineering, and economics, his early professional career was in international irrigation management. John represents the Roundtable on the Governor's Council on Climate Change, or the GC3. Coincidentally, all 4 of our panelists today are on the GC3. Maybe not entirely coincidence, but so John lives in Hartford and is active in the Hartford Friends meeting, the Hartford Friends meeting of the Quakers. John, and let me just before I hand it over, of the many topics John could speak about, the one that he has been particularly active and instrumental in the recent past is on offshore wind. So that's where we've asked John to focus today.
Thank you, Mark. It's wonderful to be here. The Roundtable on Climate and Jobs, as most of you know, builds alliances among diverse constituencies who all understand the moral imperative that we have to combat climate change in ways that promote economic and environmental justice. And it's wonderful to see a number of our partners here today. As Mark mentioned, I'm going to be talking just briefly about the work that's been happening here in Connecticut on offshore wind over the past year. And our niche often in these conversations is helping to bring labor to the table, organized labor, so that they are a constructive voice in these conversations. So I guess we'll go to I first just wanted to throw up a couple of visuals. Often when we talk about offshore wind in Connecticut, people say, well, where is it? And so on the left is a map of the federal lease areas. And one of the things that makes offshore wind important here in the Northeast is that we have good wind offshore, and we also have relatively shallow waters. On the right is the map of the lease areas for New England specifically, and where the wind for the 200 megawatts that Mary mentioned will be coming from Deepwater Wind's lease area. We want to go to the next slide. I just wanted to throw out some numbers to give people a sense of scale. Some of you have probably heard me talk about offshore wind being a good news, bad news, good news story. The good news is that we have lots of experience and track record in Europe, with now over 16,000 megawatts of offshore wind installed, 4,000 turbines in 10 countries, and that constitutes about 10% of the electricity demand. And a year ago, on one Saturday at the end of October, Europe got 25% of its total electricity in one day from wind. That was a combination of onshore and offshore. The US, the bad news, we only have 5 turbines, 30 megawatts total installed at Block Island. Again, that's the photo on the front of your program, and Deepwater Wind's inaugural project. And Acadia Center in 2017, Acadia Center being one of our partner groups here, their Energy Vision 2030 document said that if we want to meet our regional goal of a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that needed to include about 6,400 megawatts of offshore wind. At the time that that was published, that seemed fantastical. And even at that time, we didn't have a 45% target for here in Connecticut. So a lot has changed since that was put in, and I put some numbers up here. We now have contracts in process here in the U.S. for more than 1,800 megawatts, and the states are listed there. Total commitments and authority from the Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island alone is more than 9,000 megawatts by 2035. So well within or beyond the range of the Acadia Center report. And then here in Connecticut, as Mary mentioned, we've got 200 megawatts under contract, or I guess Pura is still finalizing, considering the contract, and 3 new bids under consideration. Next. I guess last night at dinner, question was raised, well, what's the bottleneck with offshore wind? And I thought later that the neck of the bottle is about to become uncorked. So the potential economic impacts, just quickly, in 2015, the roundtable put together a job study that echoed what Mark talked about earlier in terms of the jobs impact. I listed here some of the jobs. The big questions in terms of what the economic impact here in Connecticut will be are which ports up and down the East Coast are going to be the hub or hubs, which technology will be used for the bases to anchor them to the continental shelf, and which developers invest in US-based manufacturing and supply chain activities. Another quick visual, they keep growing. And this is important because as they get bigger, they get more efficient. They capture more wind, and the higher they are up in the air, the more consistent the wind is. And so you can just see this visual. The darker one in the middle is ones that are coming, giant ones. But ours that we're looking at, you see the Block Island ones on the far left here. The ones that are now envisioned for Connecticut's project are bigger than those. The Block Island ones were 6 megawatts each. The ones that are envisioned for our 200 megawatt project are 8 megawatts each. Last slide. Just a last thing on capacity factors and declining costs. As they get bigger and more efficient, Mark mentioned this morning that the floating wind turbines have achieved a 65%, I think you said 67% capacity factor. That means the consistency with which they are able to produce power. And then the declining cost, the Massachusetts 800 megawatt project is because of the low per kilowatt hour cost is projected to save ratepayers $1.4 billion over the life of the project. So these are not only good for the environment and good for the economy, but also good for ratepayers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. You know, this is such an amazing story. I wonder how many people in Connecticut realize that this could be the jobs engine that it could be. I mean, I know we've got you out there fighting the good fight, and I'm so glad so many people got to hear about it today, but this seems like a massive opportunity for Connecticut to be the place where these get built and put into place.
It's a tremendous opportunity, and we're very hopeful over the next few months we'll have a much clearer picture about exactly what will happen. The announcement a couple of months ago, or within the last several weeks, of Ørsted, which is the largest offshore wind developer in the world, purchasing deepwater wind, is, we think, good news for here. It indicates that there's a good possibility that Ørsted is going to invest significant resources in New London and New London Harbor. And so, again, things are still unfolding, but we think that New London is well placed, both in terms of the attributes of the harbor that are why we have a sub-base there, why the Coast Guard is based there, but then also because of its geographic location relative to the federal lease areas. And because we've got good transportation systems in and out of New London, opportunities for manufacturing and supply chain, we're hopeful, and it's looking very promising. This is going to be really big for Connecticut.
Very exciting.
I have one more good news item to add to your good news, bad news, which is how many people are familiar? Of course, I think people know we share a grid with all of the New England states, right? The 6 New England states. And how many people are familiar with the challenge of winter fuel security? This is great. This is a huge issue that we've been dealing with for years in New England, which is we've seen a lot of investment in gas-fired power plants, and we haven't seen the investment in the gas pipeline infrastructure to serve them reliably so that they can run in those really cold stretches that we get in January, February. And so the ISO has been really struggling with this. It's been very concerning to all the regulators working on this, that when the cold weather occurs, that we could see our current grid facing blackouts, which is terrifying as a public health, public safety concern in the middle of really cold weather. Not even factoring in people shifting to air source heat pumps for their heat source. So the really exciting news is just in the last year or so, the ISO has done some analysis, and all of a sudden, with the prices coming down for offshore wind and all this offshore wind potential in New England that's close to where all these customers are, that they're identifying that actually offshore wind, the hours when it's producing, is actually contributes a lot to those time periods when we have those winter fuel security problems. So the ISO is optimistic. This doesn't fully solve our problem, but if we see the continued investment in offshore wind and these projects get built, that this could actually, in the mid-2020s, when these projects come online, help us through this morass that we've been stuck in terms of maintaining a reliable system in the wintertime. The big question mark is are all these things going to get sited? We have a reputation in New England for being a place where it's tough to cite things. So I just throw this out to folks as well, that making sure that communities understand the full range of benefits that these types of projects provide. I think as we see these first few projects kind of rolling through the siting process, it's going to be a real testing ground to whether communities are welcoming this as a solution that's in their backyard, that may be visible, because from a reliability standpoint, from all these other benefits, this is so critical to our pathway to decarbonizing the electric grid.
That's a great answer to the question of what can people do, because when these siting discussions and decisions come up, we to mobilize people to just educate on, they're often the local interests and the negative issues tend to predominate. So to paint that larger picture is something that everybody, that all of us can do. Great, thank you. Playing cleanup today is Claire Coleman. Claire is climate and energy attorney for Connecticut Fund for the Environment. She joined CFE in November 2016. Prior to that, she worked in private practice and as counsel for the U.S. House of Representatives Oversight and Government Reform Committee, where she conducted congressional investigations and worked on a wide range of national policy issues, including environmental and energy policy and regulation. Claire earned her J.D. from Northwestern University and her B.A. in government from Cornell. Between college and law school, she served as a team leader with AmeriCorps National Civilian Community Corps. Claire, you follow Connecticut energy policy very, very closely. From what you heard today, where do you see us going, and how do you see us getting there?
Thanks so much, Mark. I'm very grateful to be here today. It's an exciting moment for our state, and I'm really grateful for Mark Jacobson for being here to help set the table and lay the foundation, specifically in terms of us having the technological feasibility to get to 100% renewable. It's great to have the science-backed confirmation that we are ready to talk about the policies that we need to get us there, and that's sort of my job, I guess, is to think about what policies does Connecticut need to get us to that path towards relying on 100% clean energy. And I think Mary said it right, that we have some great building blocks here in the state. And we need to use those building blocks to leverage our position as leaders in the clean energy revolution, and really think about how do we amp up the work we're currently doing. In order to get to that 100% renewables, we need strong policies. You've heard a reference to the renewable portfolio standard, which is the percentage that we require our utilities to obtain, the percentage of renewables that our power mix has to be. So we have a 40% by 2030 renewable target, which is fantastic. And I'd posit that we should continue to expand that, and not just expand the number of 40% by 2030, but also look at what our renewable mix is in Connecticut. We have a class 1 renewable mix that isn't actually that clean right now. We rely on a lot of out-of-state biomass, which about 70% right now of our class 1 is filled with that. So that means less room for the real zero carbon renewables like wind and solar to grow. And similarly, we have fuel cells in our class 1. Fuel cells are an important in-state economic engine, but they do have a carbon emissions output. So let's think about how to focus the state on those zero carbon renewables in order to help us meet our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. There's so much to do, just within the electric sector to get there. You've heard about energy efficiency. We really, as a state, we need to focus on reinvesting money that has been taken from our energy efficiency programs, putting it back in. And not just filling what we've taken, but building on that. Our investments in energy efficiency are a 7-to-1 return. For every $1 we put in to energy efficiency, we're saving $7. So there's no, economic argument that can be made that would be a good decision for our state not to invest in efficiency. And in order to keep reducing our emissions profile, we also have to talk about the social costs of carbon, and I'm grateful for Mark to raise that, because right now our price signals do not reflect the fact that in addition to that energy, kilowatt hour price of fossil fuel-based energy, there's also a social cost. There's the environmental and the health costs, and we have to talk more honestly about how those costs hurt our society, and on the flip side, if we're going to rely on zero carbon resources that don't have that emissions profile, what benefits do bringing more solar and wind, in addition to their kilowatt hour cost, what savings are they also helping us achieve in the health and environmental world? So I have a minute left. I also want to bring everyone's attention to the transportation sector. That's about 40% of our emissions. We have a ton of work to do in the transportation sector. We've got to put 500 electric vehicles on the road by 2030. That's not very far away. So we're looking at some legislative proposals to help make sure that we have policies in place, like building codes and state fleet requirements, that are helping us get to those goals that we know we need. And we've heard a lot about the need to do building heating and cooling transitions. I mean, there's a lot to do, and 5 minutes is not enough time to talk about all of those things. But I would end by saying, we're not going to get to these policies without building the public support and building a willingness in our leadership to help, to commit to ambitious proposals. And to do that, I think we really need to shift the narrative in Connecticut from renewables being part of the problem to renewables being the solution. So yes, we have high electricity costs in the state, but we can solve those electricity costs by bringing people cleaner, cheaper, zero carbon energy, by helping people put solar on their roofs, helping businesses reduce their their costs by connecting to grid scale or locally sited solar, and of course the offshore wind that John talked about is incredibly exciting. So we need to shift that narrative both in terms of costs to our ratepayers and also to the economy, because as we've heard and as countless studies show, the clean energy economy is a way for Connecticut to become stronger, both in terms of jobs and economic growth. Our GC3 modeling found actually that the more ambitious we are in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, the better GDP and job growth we're going to see here in Connecticut. So let's really work together to make sure we're pushing that narrative that this is a win-win for everyone. It's good for our economy, our health, and our environment. So,
Excellent.
thanks.
Thank you, Claire. I'd like to say we planned this event 2 days after the election so that we would have clear heads and minds and sort of know what's facing us. But actually, that's the date that Mark Jacobson could come. But is it too soon to comment on the watershed we just passed on Tuesday and the different sort of legislative landscape that we'll be facing, legislative and executive landscape we're looking at?
We're incredibly excited, and I didn't adequately introduce my organization. I work for Connecticut Fund for the Environment, which is a state-based organization really focused on a broad range of environmental, clean water, clean air. We do a lot of green infrastructure, on-the-ground projects, but I solely focus on our climate and energy portfolio. And from all of those perspectives, I think we're thrilled to have a new governor-elect who has clearly stated his commitment to clean energy priorities and has embraced some of those more positive narratives that I just spoke about clean energy being part of the solution to our state's economic problems. So we're thrilled about that, and we're certainly excited to have so many clean energy advocates as part of our legislature. I think there will be a shift in dynamic. The two senators who voted against the climate bill last session are no longer in our Senate. So I think we have a real opportunity here to make Connecticut even greener.
Great, exciting. Mark, do you want to, you've gotten sort of Connecticut 101 right now. Any questions you have or observations?
Well, it's a lot of good news all around, and I think in terms of future growth, this offshore wind is really a big thing. I mean, there's just limitless offshore resources. When I say limitless, because of the floating turbines, you can now go further out. And I mean, there really is just limited by policy and regulation, and hopefully that can be adjusted. But it's great to hear that there's a lot of interest in transitioning the other sectors, transportation, heating. I didn't hear much about industry yet, but I assume that's probably in there as well. So I'm pleasantly surprised that things are even moving forward, or it sounds like there's a positive motion going on, and there's a lot of potential. And I think there is so much potential in Connecticut for homes, individual homes, for solar, for retrofits, for heat pumps, for electric cars, for as I mentioned, offshore wind, even some onshore wind, and other thing, and even the fact that you're addressing the grid issues, trying to make the grid more stable with growth of renewables. That's all positive. So I'll just leave it at that. That sounds good.
I think one of the really interesting, surprising things about your work, Mark, I think most of us were not surprised that we get enough energy from the sun and from the wind to power our economy. But what was interesting, and I know you've done a lot of work on this, is that you can also do it when you need it at the right time, that the grid can be stable. So I mean, that was, to me, a really interesting part of your work and the most surprising part.
Yeah, well, because because we actually we've mapped offshore wind resources off the East Coast quite a bit, and one of the conclusions we found in a paper a few years ago was there was this nice match of peak demand with offshore wind because of the sea breeze that comes in. And so there's another advantage. In addition to being more regular and also providing electricity at night, at the peak time of the day, there's also a hump in the offshore wind resource. And the resource, as you go further north, starting in South Carolina, starting South Carolina northward, the wind resource just gets better and better. So as you get to Connecticut, it's really good offshore.
I have to say that I've never seen our grid operators so excited about a renewable resource coming online as they are about offshore wind. And I'm, at the same time, they're kind of pointing to like solar. Solar actually doesn't perform so well during the wintertime because of snow cover, or it just the hours of, when people are turning on their, the hours when we really need that performance that gas pipelines are providing. It's not the afternoon, a sunny afternoon. So I think that's what when I said that kind of, the kumbaya, that we need to all listen to each other, that's what I'm really talking about. Is I think that different people are just solving for different pieces of this puzzle. The grid operator, the utilities, we hold them responsible to maintain reliability at a very high level, right? And so being able to hear, they need to understand what the public policies are, what the carbon goals are that are coming from the legislature, coming from the administration, and then being able to say, okay, well then, can you focus more on this type of resource, this type of renewable resource, which is going to check more boxes that I need for reliability, for example, for the grid. That's the kind of listening and communication that we really need, so that we can make sure that the dollars that we're investing in this transition are going to the things that are checking the most boxes and providing for the most of the benefits that we all need.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, in terms of sort of pushing the grid toward more renewables, I mentioned that in Europe a year ago, there was a day when 25% of their electricity demand came from wind. The comparable story here is that Rhode Island, while their contract that they are signing with Deepwater Wind is relatively small, it's 400 megawatts, because they're a small state, that constitutes 25% of their electricity demand. And so they are really pushing here, and we talk in Connecticut about being a small state but exercising leadership on these issues. Rhode Island is doing that as well, and it's a challenge to us in terms of offshore wind here in Connecticut of really boosting our commitment. And in terms of these potential economic impacts and the potential investments, it's really a matter of how quickly and how firmly and aggressively do we move forward in terms of whether the developers are going to shift some of their investments in manufacturing to the U.S. And so being aggressive and fast is important. I want to also just piggyback on something Claire said, that Claire mentioned a couple of senators that won't be coming back. I want to mention that we're also pleased with the ones that are coming back. And we've got on both sides of the aisle. And so Representative Albus, who's here today, and Representative Steinberg, and Representative Arconti, who's also co-chair of the Clean Energy Caucus. But then on the Republican side, we've also got both of the who were co-chairs of Energy and Technology this past year, Representative Ackert and then Senator Formica, who are both coming back. Senator Formica has been incredibly supportive of the offshore wind. And then also Devin Carney, who is also co-chair of the Clean Energy Caucus. So I'm excited about the possibilities moving into this next legislative session.
Great. My sense from the panel today is that renewable energy works not only to meet our needs, but it's actually going to save us money in the end and is going to create jobs. Because one of the big objections we constantly hear is, well, it sounds great, but we can't afford it. So have we buried that one today? I mean,
I think that's a really important point, and we need to shift our analysis on costs to a longer term trajectory in order to overcome that hurdle. So yes, because we're building new things by putting in wind turbines and solar arrays, there are going to be upfront costs. But when you look at over a lifetime, these resources are renewable, don't have ongoing fuel costs, and of course don't have the environmental and health impacts. So over a lifetime, they're more cost effective. Now we do have, in this room we may have buried that, but that's going to be an issue in our legislature in the upcoming sessions. We have a rule that was put on the books in 2017 that requires what's called a ratepayer impact statement, which means which could be interpreted in a way, depending on how the analysis is done, to really discourage pro-renewable energy legislation because of upfront investment costs. So, we're going to be fighting to make sure that that law on the books is interpreted in a way that looks holistically and also potentially at removing it because of the concern of the way it's going to be applied. We do, as environmental advocates, we do care a lot about ratepayer costs and do want to do the most cost-effective proposals, but our legislature isn't necessarily equipped to do that analysis on the fly when there's 30 bills that they're trying to get through in the course of a couple of weeks, and we're really concerned that that could have a negative impact on our ability to pass more legislation allowing and authorizing more renewable investments.
To me, any conversation of costs, the first thing that comes to mind is all of the external environmental costs that we haven't, I think to your point, we haven't fully internalized. So even if you were to apply, a social cost of carbon to the electric sector, transportation, if you were to, do a full economy-wide carbon tax or, cap and trade, any of these sort of programs, I think, would sort of reset that initial equation of what is, quote, cost effective. So I just put that out there as like sort of the framing. From a political perspective, though, actually implementing that type of policy, whether it's sector by sector or economy wide, is going to be challenging. I know we had some discouraging news nationally, from some states that were like Washington trying to advance those kind of policies. So the divide in my mind is like any type of policy that's framed as like a tax or an additional cost up front, doesn't resonate with voters, but clean energy, as the polling that you were showing, clean energy clearly does. So then to me, it's if it may be a while politically before we are at a place where we have a full sort of economically efficient cost to this pollution, and we have dollars that we want to spend on clean energy. Can we make sure that we're spending those dollars as effectively as possible? And so we try and do that from our perspective when we run our RFPs for grid scale renewables. I think that, again, I mentioned that competition we've seen the prices come down over time, which is terrific. But we also are, when we make those selections, we do try and take into account the in-state economic potential, giving points for people who are going to be, or for projects that will have that in-state benefit. But also just being able to compare, what are the features of those resources that we want. I think probably you would not want the state to be, selecting resources in a way that wasn't giving you the best bang for your buck. So we've tried to think about cost from that perspective as well, and making sure that we're sensitive to that. And I think going forward, we're also going to be more nuanced in what types of new renewable resources do we need to bring online. I think you were pointing out, it's not just a quantity game, but it's also the specific attributes. So, those like offshore wind that can address, issues on the grid with winter fuel security, that's great. There's also additional things through the grid modernization proceeding about, siting overall within the state. Are there better and worse places where renewables can be to actually help save ratepayers money? I think that's important to us to think about as well, and just in terms of that prioritization. So, a couple thoughts there.
I mean, everything costs money. And so building renewables, we've seen these costs come down, significantly. I think this is really the good news of the last, few years. And Professor Jacobson's presentation is really, just exciting from the standpoint of these technologies that are necessary for this transformation exist. And they're commercially available, and the more people are buying them and investing in them, the more the costs are coming down. So that's very, very good news that we can feel good about. I think what I think about a lot as an economic regulator is about value. The cost benefit analysis, you can fill this room with economists and rate analysts and so on, and they will all, argue about which benefits count and which costs count and so on and so forth, and they can come up with an avoided cost and, a theoretical way to to come up with whether, renewables are cost effective or not and what have you. What I think about a lot is, though, what value are we getting? Are we actually getting all of the value from the resources that we're investing in? Because we have a whole market structure. I'll just pick on the ISO New England, for example, because that's not my job. But that's procuring, traditional sources of power. They do it in a fuel neutral way, through a day ahead market, through an annual capacity market. And so that market is humming along, and it's procuring things that aren't necessarily consistent with the carbon goals. And so here we have a state policy that's driving investment in renewables, it's driving investment in energy efficiency, it's driving investment in PV that's on somebody's rooftop. If the utilities don't have the infrastructure on the distribution system to see what's happening, to have sensing technologies, to have visibility into how that PV on your rooftop is operating and when it's operating and when it's not operating, then they can't factor that into their planning, right? And then the ISO New England, that's determining how much generation we have to buy, traditional generation, they're not taking it into account, right? So that's a really important piece of this. It's not just that we figure out the cost effectiveness in the abstract, that we make sure that all these different planning steps are tying together. And we've achieved a lot of great things here where now the ISO New England, when they're calculating how many power plants Connecticut has to have in order to keep the lights on, they give us credit for the energy efficiency funds that the legislature has authorized for the Conservation Load Management Program. They give us credit for the solar PV that's been funded through the various programs in the state, and they take that, subtract that off the top of what we have to purchase. And so that means we're actually getting the value from the things that we're investing in. And it's taken some time to even achieve that, to make sure that they have the faith that those resources are actually going to perform, because above all else, they cannot let the lights go out. So that's what's troubling, when we have the uncertainty of a legislative rate into the conservation funds, for example, is that having fought so hard to get the ISO to give us credit for these things and have confidence that those resources are actually going to show up, then they start to, scratch their heads and say, well, can we really count on that? So stability of these things and proving that these investments are there and making sure that the utilities have, the technology on their system to be able to see how it's performing so it can be incorporated in how that grid is operating. That's how we get the value from these resources. So we're not building two separate grids. One, a set of power plants, that the ISO has procured, and another, a set of resources that we've purchased through our various public policy programs.
Right. Great. I want to entertain questions from the audience, but before we do, I told you this was an amazing panel, so let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. All right. I know a lot of people have questions, so we're going to be pretty tough on keeping people to very brief questions. So, Chuck, I think you had a question. Do you still, or did it get answered? You still do? Okay. Wait for the microphone, and please be brief. We want to get to a lot of different topics.
That's easier said than done. I'll just limit it to raising a distinction between renewable and distributed. And I'd like maybe Mary and Katie to talk a little bit about, you've talked about the utility needing to ensure reliability and manage cost and value. One of the things the utility is also very focused on is extracting revenue. So as I think of this in terms of distributed as well as renewable versus centralized. You think about what's attractive to the utilities are things that are still within their revenue stream. Distributed potentially disrupts that, but is also potentially getting rid of large-scale capital expense in building out that long-distance transmission and distribution system. So can you guys talk a little bit about how that tension gets played out in the policy side?
I think this is a really, I mean, the utilities are not, they're not state-owned enterprises. These are investor-owned companies with shareholders, and they have a duty to their shareholders to maximize, the revenues. And so as the sort of regulatory compact here is that because they have captive customers, we need to ensure that the rates that they're charging are reasonable. We need to, make sure that we have a good sense of the investments that they're making, that they're prudent, and then they are entitled to a reasonable return on equity on what they're doing. So I think the key with the distribution system planning docket and thinking ahead in terms of grid modernization is, with all this change in how customers are consuming power, these various public policies, it changes the paradigm for the utilities as well. And so we have to think about what is the profit motive for the utility? How do you align it with the new types of services, the new types of reliability objectives that they have, including integrating new types of load in a really cost-effective manner, for example, and how do we create performance incentives that make sure that is actually something that their shareholders can see some value in. So that has to be part of the equation as well. That's right. Yep.
Great. Another question? Right here. We've got the microphone coming over.
So I understand the complexity of keeping all of us warm in the winter and supplying energy. But so as my household, I just installed solar panels on my roof. Took me 3 years thinking about it, 1 year into a contract, and I'm still waiting to be connected. And my thought was, this is not justified. I mean, I'm going to cover it within 6 to 12 years. I don't know. But I feel that it's like a splurge. It's like I'm spending a lot of money. But still, I'm going to cover it within about 10 years. But I was wondering if we used economy of scale and had somebody like Mark Jacobson calculate, can't we save $2 billion in 10 years and get Connecticut out of the deficit using these technologies? And Claire also mentioned you save $7 on any $1 invested. So isn't there a way that we could, just say, we're going to do this because we want to get Connecticut out of our deficit, and I don't know, maybe raise a little bit the gasoline tax? I don't know.
Is this our way out? Yeah.
So I would like somebody to do the calculation and say, if I'm doing it and within 1 year I'm having for my household renewable, then why does it have to take until 2050 for the whole state? Thank you.
Let me just comment on one thing you mentioned, because in an individual home, it's actually the most expensive PV is for one home. But it turns out if you have a few homes, like 3 or 4 that go in together, or a little community, then the cost is actually about half per person or per home. And then you go to commercial scale, and it's even less expensive, like commercial buildings. And then you go to utility scale, and it's the cheapest. So one thing that can be done if you're talking about economies of scale is just to have communities go in together. But state incentives help, but there is a federal tax credit right now for solar, 30% still, which is helpful. So that's a reason for a lot of people to want to do it. But I think a lot of it is most people aren't aware, or you went through the trouble, but there's a learning curve for most people. They're kind of afraid to spend the time, or don't want to spend the time to figure it out, what to do and which companies to work with. So I think that's where a lot of state agencies or environmental groups can actually help to educate the public about trying to reduce the barriers to people actually doing this.
I would just say, I think the state has come a long way in developing our solar industry, but I think you're right that we're not at the sort of widespread, consumer awareness. It's not a streamlined process. Every house is a little bit different. Every installation is going to be a little bit different. They would need data on, what your needs are going to be. So it's not a off-the-shelf kind of solution yet. But I will say, I think one of the tensions that our office has, been struggling with is sort of the trade-offs between, what we prioritize in our renewable policy. There's sort of the pull to prioritize the lowest cost renewable, sort of the utility scale. The trade-off there is we don't, we're not in Oklahoma or Texas that has huge cleared, areas of land where you can really do this stuff at scale. And I think, so we're working within a more densely populated state. Katie was mentioning some of the siting tensions that can happen at a local level. Just point out there, I think one of the ways we've tried to navigate that space is through better information and mapping and incorporating that into our RFPs. So, for instance, in this past zero carbon RFP that we put out, we actually put, some pretty tight restrictions around utility scale solar siting, based on the feedback we were getting of, we don't want to be, as a state, encouraging clear cutting of forests or other state, assets to do that. So we said, okay, it's going to be less, put in a bid for less than 20, megawatts utility scale solar, restrictions on the sort of slope that you'd be working with, other restrictions, and we saw a number of projects come in through that were very cost competitive. So that tells me there's still a number of good sites in the state that wouldn't be impinging on our natural resources. So that's, we're trying to improve the siting experience on the utility side. On the distributed side, again, we're going through this process of understanding the benefits of siting stuff more locally, and we think there are many benefits. Historically, the cost for doing that has been higher. I mean, the fact that you're expressing the longer payback period is a reflection and part of the cost that it takes to do things at that scale. So we're also trying to balance, what do we see the value of, as a state, prioritizing greater incentives, greater prioritization at the local level versus this utility scale. So it's something we're trying to balance, and I don't think we have a perfect portrait of, which percentage, should be coming from each of these resources or scales. But those are some of the things we're trying to think about.
Claire?
Just to add to that, I think we have to think about distributed generation not just providing energy in the same way that grid scale does, which does provide economies of scale, but we're also helping with resiliency and potentially helping with offsetting other transmission distribution costs that the utilities have to spend. But just to add to the equation, we've talked a lot about rooftop and we've talked about grid scale, but we do have a sort of in-between option that's coming online soon in Connecticut, which is called shared solar or community solar, and very exciting. We have 25 megawatts a year for 6 years currently, but we're hoping to show the excitement and demand for that and grow that number quickly, because shared solar does have the benefits of the economy of scale that rooftop may not have, but it allows people who may not be able to put solar on their rooftop or live in a multifamily unit to access solar directly and do it in a cost-effective manner. So we're really excited about that.
Great. We've got a question here in the front, Bob, and then Scott in the back. And we're running out of time, so we'll try to be quick.
Yes, I'd like to bring in another renewable energy, human renewable energy. I saw a presentation by a fellow from Portland, Oregon, last Friday night. 14% of the trips in the city are by bicycle. And they have, and their studies have shown that bicycle infrastructure is more cost effective than public transportation, and of course way more effective compared to motor vehicle transportation. And I really think that we should, it's kind of educating the cities to take this up. And if we could, it's a low-hanging fruit.
Yep. Any commentary from
I got here by bike today. Anybody else?
Yeah, there we go. All right. David, all right. Scott?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to the panel members, and couldn't be more excited for the way you pointed out some of our great accomplishments: shared solar, the offshore wind, the renewable portfolio standard. But let's talk about the future. We built this great platform in 2018, and what are our priorities going to be in 2019? And I'd like to ask the panel to share their thoughts on a couple of actions that we worked on this year and didn't get anywhere just yet. But one of them is the direct EV sales bill in the state legislature. And the other one is the issue of the net metering associated with the shared solar, the time frame for the net metering. So I'd like to get your kind of reaction to that. Those are kind of maybe the focus ones. And the third one would be, can we get a carbon fee and dividend in this state and in partnership with states around us to really help accelerate off the platform that we've built in the recent years?
I'll start. Connecticut Fund for the Environment and the Electric Vehicle Coalition, the Connecticut Electric Vehicle Coalition, which we help coordinate, have been strong supporters of the EV direct sales bill, and we hope that this will be the year that it happens. Tesla is the really driving force behind electric vehicle sales here in Connecticut. We feel we need an all hands-on-deck approach to getting electric vehicles on the roads in Connecticut, and why have the obstacle that the majority of other states have recognized is unnecessary in requiring vehicles be sold through dealers. We also having electric vehicle direct sales can also help with our increased sales revenue, and that provides revenue to the state. So we're going to be in another budget year. It seems to be an obvious solution on many ways. So hopefully that will happen.
Great. Let's not talk about net metering. Otherwise, we have to ask Katie to leave. So. And we don't want that.
Or we could hold it to the end if you like, and I can.
Yeah. Right. Was that some? Yeah. Sorry, these mics. Yeah. All right. Right here. You okay? Doing a few more? Yeah. Doing a few more questions. Okay.
Hello. This may be a little bit on left field. It's not technical, but according to the keynote address, it's often the social acceptability of what we're progressing or putting forward. And my question is anyone working on introducing these topics into the schools, into the public schools, so that kids of any age, but especially high school age, particularly since there was a House bill, I gather, passed recently that would support courses to do with climate and I'm sure energy, if it goes with STEM, with the science requirements. And so I think that's very important. I don't know if anyone's addressing it.
Mark? Peter, is that one off?
Well, so at the college level, I'll just mention that I'm actually starting to teach a class in the spring, which will be an online class that'll be more limited. Stanford charges for a few $100s, but next year it'll hopefully be a massively online course that'll be free to the public. And that's the whole course is called 100% Clean and Renewable Energy and Storage for Everything. And it's basically that's the goal, is to get this information out to the large scale to millions of people through an online course. That's at the college level, doesn't address the high school and elementary.
So you
sort of demonstrating how to plan for and begin implementing the 100% strategy at the local level. And we've got 4 or 5 municipalities that have committed to, kind of being test sites. And very critical to that is local education. Diane Lantakis from Sierra Club right here, and Samantha Dynowski from also Sierra, maybe here, I'm not sure. But yeah, so that's going to be very seriously addressed, and, be very excited to work with Dr. Jacobson's resources and others that we've got here.
Great. Henry?
Okay. First, in the latest IPCC report that came out 2 weeks ago, threatening us with the need to act even faster and more severely, they priced the price of carbon, the social cost of carbon, at somewhere between several hundred to a couple of $1,000 per ton of CO2, which is massively higher than the currently talked about values of 10 to 50. The second one is, I'll put in a plug for Claire Coleman's colleague, the Solar Energy Association of Connecticut, on this Saturday, 2 days from now, is having Claire's colleague talk about community shared solar, and I don't have any interest in that except that I'm going. Somewhere in Manchester, I don't remember. Manchester Police Station at 2 o'clock. Community room. All right. Third comment. There are so many EVs out nowadays that the market for used EVs is growing, and I think that should be a factor as we go on. It's obviously going to get larger and larger. My question is directed to Katie Dykes. These dockets, to me, as an I won't say a layman, but some interest, seem terribly intricate. I mean, I don't approach them, but just the concept is really forbidding, and you're inviting the public comments. What factors can we bring to commenting when we're addressing, a particular docket? Thanks very much.
Isn't that a really fair question? You were very nice in not even saying how hard it is to navigate our website, but that's also true. But it is something that I want to think about more in terms of how we often put out questions for comment, but they're fairly technical in nature. And so how we can try to design questions that may be a little bit more, accessible to the general public. I would also note that, we have an Office of Consumer Counsel for the state. So they are representing consumers, and, they're a phone call away to the extent that you want to let them know as a consumer things that you'd like them to be looking out for in their advocacy, because they're a party in every single docket. And then in this particular distribution system planning docket and other dockets, there are often advocates who are involved. So I know like Acadia and CFE and others are very active. And so sometimes that may be a good conduit since they have to sit there and listen to all the back and forth in the long hearings, just to hear about, what's going on and what's at stake and where you may want to express a view. But I think we want to hear from you, and also it's important for us to explain, our decisions and explain what the issues are in a way that people reading these things, can really get oriented again to what are the considerations that are driving these decisions. So I'm going to take that one back, but I think there are definitely people who are in the room who are representing consumers and environmental views who can help to funnel those and channel those interests.
Okay.
I'll add a plug. I'll add a plug on the grid modernization docket as one of the environmental groups involved, that it is really a place where a lot is happening. We talked about the need to change the utility business model to be more aligned with our environmental and climate and security goals. That's a place we can make that happen. We've talked about the need for more electric vehicle chargers, that is a place where we can, get ask the utility regulators to ask the utilities to submit proposals to invest in electric vehicle, wiring infrastructure to allow for other third-party suppliers to come in. Kind of apart from the grid modernization docket, you also mentioned cheaper in our electric vehicle incentives, and that's a critical program that this state has had, but we don't have a sustainable funding source for. And in fact, some of you may not have noticed, in October the incentive levels were reduced, which to me highlights the importance for getting an institutional sustainable funding source, because this is the time when we need those incentives as EV technologies have increased, as costs of EVs are coming down enough for the average person to think about buying them. We need the incentives to help bridge that gap. So this is not the time to reduce those incentives. So hopefully we'll be looking at solutions to provide sustainable funding for cheaper as well.
Great. We'll do one more question.
Just a comment. I've been engulfed in sustainable Connecticut for the last 6 months. Before that, I was with John with the round table and so forth. How do they complement one another? My understanding is they've brought in the economic factor as well as the environmental factor. And there's 169 towns that are registering for it and taking part of the program. So how does that coordinate with what other programs that you're presenting that are available in the state?
Question, how does sustainable CT work with other programs?
I'll just give a little bit of response to that. I think, first of all, I think that part of what I've seen in my time working on these issues here in the state is that the different programs and advocates and organizations are working much more closely together now than even 5 years ago. And I think that speaks well of the current group of leaders that we have, and specific people and groups that have stepped forward and said we need to be collaborating. And in terms of sustainable CT, I think it's for those that don't know about it, it's a communities certification process that just got kicked off a year ago, and they just had their first round of communities that were certified as bronze or silver for taking very sustainable actions. And at this point, 40% of the towns in the state, I think, are participating. And I think it cuts across a lot of the different work of all these other organizations. So it's a way for local communities to plug in. Bob, who mentioned cycling, there's something around complete streets and how communities can encourage that. There's the clean energy pieces. So it's a way for local communities to do very tangible things. And I think that the other ways that we've heard today of how different groups complement each other, the work that the Sierra Club is doing in terms of getting communities to commit to 100%, and then the work that Mark's group and other organizations are doing is saying, okay, here's how you get there. So I think a lot of that is happening, and we need to do more. Our organization, as you mentioned, we help to build alliances and collaboration among unexpected allies, if you will. And with the offshore wind, it's been really wonderful to have the building trades come forward and be very actively engaged in pushing for and promoting clean energy projects. And then in the transportation, we've just seen the transportation lockbox amendment passed, and that was also building trades working together with transit advocates. So I'm excited about the degree of collaboration that is emerging. It's not to say we don't still have disagreements, but by building relationships of trust, we're able to navigate those disagreements.
Wonderful. Claire?
I'd just add to John's comments, because I wouldn't want us to leave here today without thinking about and acknowledging the important role environmental justice communities play, and how these climate policies that we're seeking to adapt are most needed in communities where pollution from power plants or cars impacts community of color and communities of lower income the most. So really, we've talked about the need to engage a lot of different communities. We've talked about the important economic message, but we need to also work together as a community to engage people within our environmental justice communities and continue to build that coalition so that we have, we want to have both a sort of top-down and grassroots and grass tops, or whatever the definition is, but really our climate goals represent the interests of everyone in this room and everyone in our society, and we want to be inclusive in the way that we're advocating for these goals.
All right. I think we could continue this discussion for quite a long time, but I think Mark has a flight to catch, and some people probably need to get back to work. So join me in thanking our wonderful panel.